When everyone on the plane gets sick from bad food, only 11-year-old Maya stays awake. The pilots can't fly. The adults don't believe a little girl can save them. But Maya knows about planes from her pilot dad. Now she must land the big airplane or everyone will die. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. 11-year-old Maya Chin sat alone in the airport waiting area, a bright yellow, unaccompanied minor badge pinned to her small backpack. She was tiny for her age, with curious dark eyes hidden behind wire-rimmed glasses. While other kids her age might be playing games on their tablets, Maya was studying flight simulator controls and reviewing aircraft procedures on her screen. Sarah, a cheerful flight attendant in her 30s, approached with a clipboard and a warm smile. "Maya? I'm Sarah and I'll be taking care of you today. Are you excited to see your grandparents in Seattle?" Maya looked up from her tablet, adjusting her glasses. "Yes, ma'am." "Is this a Boeing 737-800? The engines sound like CFM56s from here." Sarah laughed, the kind of laugh adults use when children say something they think is cute but don't take seriously. "Oh, you're one of those airplane crazy kids. That's so sweet. Come on, let's get you boarded first." Maya frowned slightly at being called cute, but followed Sarah down the jetway. She hated when adults dismissed her knowledge just because of her age. Her father had been teaching her about aviation since she was 7, and she knew more about aircraft systems than most people realized. Once on the plane, Sarah led Maya to seat 12F, a window seat. As the cabin filled with passengers, Maya immediately pressed her face to the window, studying the wing flaps and engine with an expert eye. She pulled out a worn notebook labeled Flight Logs Ma and Dad, in her careful handwriting. "Now, Maya," Sarah said, adjusting the young girl's seatbelt, "I want you to stay in your seat during the flight, okay? Press this button if you need anything. And no wandering around, it's not safe for little girls." Maya nodded, but her attention was already focused on the pre-flight checks happening outside her window. She opened her notebook, revealing detailed drawings of cockpit layouts, emergency procedures, and flight calculations that would have impressed any pilot. The businessman in seat 12E glanced over at Maya's notebook as he settled in. He was in his 40s, wearing an expensive suit and carrying the tired look of someone who traveled frequently for work. "Playing pilot, huh? That's adorable. When I was your age, I wanted to be an astronaut." "I'm not playing," Maya said seriously. "My dad's a pilot for Alaska Airlines. He taught me about aircraft systems and emergency procedures. This is real information." The businessman barely looked at her as he interrupted, "That's nice, honey," before turning away to check his phone. Maya's face fell. It was always the same. Adults saw her age and immediately assumed she was just pretending or playing make-believe. In the cockpit, Captain Rodriguez, a 50-something pilot with decades of experience, ran through the pre-flight checklist with his first officer, Jamie, who was about 30 and sharp-focused. "Weather looks good all the way to Seattle," the captain noted. "Should be a smooth flight. 2.5 hours. Catering just came on board," Jamie replied, checking her notes. "They're serving the crew meal right after takeoff." "Perfect. I'm starving," Captain Rodriguez said, looking forward to the break that would come once they reached cruising altitude. As the plane taxied to the runway, Maya pressed her face to the window and whispered to herself, following along with the takeoff procedure she had memorized from countless hours with her father. "V1, rotate speed, positive rate, gear up." The Boeing 737 lifted off smoothly, and Maya felt the familiar thrill of flight. But she noticed the businessman staring at her strangely. "Do you actually understand what you're saying?" he asked with obvious skepticism. "Dad taught me," Maya explained patiently. "The pilots pull back on the yoke at VR speed, that's rotation speed. Then when they have positive rate of climb, they retract the landing gear to reduce drag and improve performance." The businessman looked even more skeptical. "Right. Sure they do." He put on his noise-canceling headphones, effectively dismissing her. Maya felt the familiar sting of being ignored by adults who couldn't believe a child might know something they didn't. 30 minutes into the flight, the plane was cruising smoothly at 36,000 feet. Maya had pulled out approach plates for Seattle-Tacoma International Airport from her notebook and was studying the complex diagrams when Sarah appeared with a juice box and cookies. "How are you doing, sweetie? Want some snacks?" Sarah asked cheerfully. Maya looked up from her charts. "Sarah, do you know what the missed approach procedure is for Seattle-Tacoma runway 16L? Sarah laughed again, that same dismissive adult laugh. "Oh honey, you don't need to worry about big grown-up pilot stuff like that. That's for the captains to handle. You just enjoy your flight and let the adults take care of everything. Maya's jaw tightened with frustration. But I do know about these procedures. My dad taught me because he said knowledge could save lives someday. Why don't you play some games on your tablet instead? Sarah suggested, already walking away to attend to other passengers. Maya looked around the cabin with growing irritation. Adults were reading newspapers, sleeping, working on laptops, chatting about business deals and vacation plans. None of them took her seriously. They saw her as just another child who needed to be managed and entertained, not someone who might actually possess valuable knowledge. In the cockpit, Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Jamie were enjoying their crew meals, the same food that had been served to the passengers in first class. "This chicken tastes a little off," Jamie mentioned, taking another bite. "Yeah, airline catering," Captain Rodriguez replied with a shrug. "What can you do? At least it's hot." They continued eating, neither realizing they were consuming food that had been improperly stored and was already contaminated with dangerous bacteria. 45 minutes into the flight, Maya noticed something that made her uneasy. The plane had been flying straight and level for too long. There should have been small course corrections or altitude changes by now. She checked her watch against the flight plan she had memorized and felt a knot forming in her stomach. Suddenly, a passenger in first class, an older man in his 60s named Mr. Peterson, stumbled into the aisle, clutching his stomach and looking pale. I don't feel well," he gasped before collapsing onto the carpet. Other passengers gasped and pointed. Sarah rushed forward, her cheerful demeanor replaced by professional concern. "Sir? Sir, can you hear me?" she called, kneeling beside the unconscious man. But Mr. Peterson wasn't the only one. Within minutes, more passengers began feeling violently ill. One by one they slumped in their seats or fell to the floor, their faces pale and sweaty. Sarah grabbed the intercom with trembling hands. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a medical emergency," her voice announced throughout the cabin, no longer steady and professional. "If there's a doctor on board, please identify yourself immediately. Sarah never finished the announcement. She suddenly dropped the intercom and collapsed, unconscious before she hit the floor. Maya looked around in growing horror. Nearly every adult on the plane was either unconscious or severely ill, groaning and barely responsive. She was one of only a handful of people still alert and aware. The businessman next to her had slumped forward, unconscious, his expensive suit wrinkled and his breathing shallow. "Oh no. Oh no, oh no," Maya whispered to herself, her heart racing. She unbuckled her seatbelt with shaking hands and stood up, her legs feeling weak with fear. The plane continued flying straight on autopilot, but Maya knew they would need to land eventually. And there was no one left to fly the plane. She pushed through the unlocked cockpit door, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Jamie were both slumped over their controls, completely unconscious. The autopilot was still engaged, keeping the plane level and on course, but Maya could see warning lights starting to flash on the instrument panel. "Food poisoning," she said to herself, her voice barely a whisper. "It has to be. Dad always said never eat airline food if your crew, because if the pilots get sick, everyone dies." Maya stared at the incredibly complex instrument panel, feeling completely overwhelmed. Her notebook, which had seemed so important and complete just an hour ago, suddenly felt very small and inadequate in her trembling hands. But she forced herself to think clearly. "Okay, Maya," she said aloud, trying to calm herself down. "What would Dad do? First thing, communicate with air traffic control." In the cabin behind her, the few passengers who hadn't eaten the contaminated meal were starting to panic as they realized the scope of the emergency. A middle-aged woman was crying hysterically. "What's happening? Where are the flight attendants? Why is no one helping us?" A man who seemed slightly more composed was looking toward the cockpit. "Someone needs to check on the pilots. This can't be happening." Maya heard the commotion but forced herself to focus. She climbed into the observer seat behind the pilots and put on Captain Rodriguez's headset with hands that shook so badly she could barely manage the simple task. "Seattle Center?" she said into the microphone, her voice small and uncertain. This is United Flight 847. The radio crackled to life immediately. "United 847, Seattle Center. Go ahead." Maya took a deep breath, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Seattle Center, we have an emergency. The pilots are unconscious. Most of the passengers are unconscious. I think it's food poisoning from the crew meal." There was a long pause on the radio. When the controller spoke again, his voice was careful and controlled. "United 847, say again? Who is this?" My name is Maya Chin, she replied, her voice stronger now. I'm 11 years old. I'm the only person awake who knows anything about flying. The silence that followed seemed to last forever. Maya, the controller finally said, and she could hear him choosing his words very carefully. I'm Controller Johnson. Can you tell me your current situation? What do your instruments show? Maya looked at the instrument panel, grateful for all those hours her father had spent explaining each gauge and display. We're at 36,000 feet. Autopilot is engaged. Airspeed is 450 knots. Heading 285 degrees. Fuel shows about 8,000 pounds remaining. She could almost hear Controller Johnson's amazement through the radio. Maya, how do you know how to read those instruments? My dad's a pilot for Alaska Airlines, Maya explained. He's been teaching me since I was 7. He said that knowledge could save lives someday, and I guess today is someday. The conscious passengers had crowded behind Maya in the cockpit doorway, and their panic was growing by the minute. The middle-aged woman was now almost screaming. A child? A child is flying the plane? This is impossible. She's just a little girl. A man in a business suit was shaking his head violently. This is insane. I don't care what her father taught her. She's 11 years old. She can't possibly know how to land a commercial airliner. Maya turned around to face them, her fear giving way to determination. Her voice was shaky but firm. I know more about flying than anyone else who's awake right now. Do any of you know what V-speeds are? Do you know how to configure flaps for landing? Do you know the difference between an ILS approach and a visual approach? The adults stared at her in stunned silence. Maya continued, her voice growing stronger. Do you know what to do if we encounter wind shear on final approach? Do you know how to calculate landing distance for different runway conditions? Do you know how to use the flight management computer? Still silence. Then please, Maya said, turning back to the radio, let me try to get us down safely. We're going to run out of fuel eventually, and someone has to fly this plane. Controller Johnson's voice came through the headset, calm and professional. Maya, you're doing great. I'm going to help you through this. First, I need you to tell me, are you familiar with the autopilot system? Yes, sir, Maya replied, consulting her notebook. Dad taught me about the autopilot. We're currently in LNAV and VNAV mode, following the flight plan. But we'll need to disconnect it eventually to land. That's exactly right, Johnson said, and Maya could hear the relief in his voice. Maya, I'm going to get our best approach controller to help you, and we're also getting a 737 instructor pilot on the radio. They'll walk you through everything step by step. Over the next hour, Maya found herself thrust into the most intense learning experience of her life. The approach controller, a woman named Linda Carson, had a calm, reassuring voice that helped Maya focus. The instructor pilot, Captain Mike Stevens, was patient and methodical as he guided her through procedures she had only read about in her father's training manuals. Maya, we're going to bring you into Seattle-Tacoma, Captain Stevens explained. It's a big airport with long runways, which gives us the best chance for a safe landing. But first we need to descend and slow down. Are you ready to start working with the autopilot controls? Maya's hands were sweating as she gripped the notebook. I think so. Dad always said the most important thing is to not rush and to double-check everything. Your dad sounds like a smart pilot, Captain Stevens said warmly. Now, I want you to look at the autopilot panel. You should see buttons labeled Alt, VS, and SPD. Can you find those? Maya scanned the panel. Yes, I see them. Perfect. Now we're going to start our descent. I want you to turn the altitude selector knob to 10,000 feet. Turn it slowly, don't rush. Maya's small hands turned the knob carefully, watching as the digital display changed. Okay, it's set to 10,000 feet. Excellent. Now push the VS button, that's vertical speed. The autopilot will start taking us down. Maya felt the plane begin to descend, and her stomach lurched with both the motion and her fear. Behind her, the conscious passengers watched in terrified fascination as this tiny girl operated controls they had never even noticed during their many flights. Maya, you're doing beautifully, Linda Carson's voice came through the headset. We're going to clear all other traffic out of your way. You're going to have the entire airport to yourself. As they descended through 20,000 feet, Maya had to overcome new challenges. The air traffic control instructions were complex, and she had to operate systems she had only read about. When Captain Stevens told her to extend the speed brakes to help slow down, she had to search the cockpit for the right control. Dad always said the speed brake handle looks like a house with a roof, she muttered to herself, finally finding the lever and pulling it up. She felt the plane slow down immediately. Perfect, Maya, Captain Stevens said. Now we need to talk about configuring the plane for landing. This is going to be the hard part. Maya's notebook was now spread across the observer seat, along with several approach plates she had found in the flight bag. Her father had always told her that preparation and knowledge were a pilot's best tools, and she was using every bit of information she had learned. Captain Stevens, I know I need to extend flaps and landing gear, but I'm scared I'll do it wrong, Maya admitted, her voice small. Maya, listen to me, Captain Stevens said, his voice warm and encouraging. Your father trained you well. You've gotten us this far safely. Trust your knowledge and trust yourself. We're all here to help you. The conscious passengers had grown quiet, realizing that their lives truly were in the hands of this remarkable 11-year-old girl. The businessman who had dismissed her earlier was now watching with amazement as Maya professionally communicated with air traffic control and operated complex aircraft systems. As they approached 5,000 feet, Maya began the landing configuration sequence. Flaps 5, she announced, moving the flap lever to the first position. The plane's nose pitched slightly as the wing configuration changed. Beautiful, Maya, Captain Stevens said. How does she feel? Maya realized she was actually feeling the aircraft through the controls, just like her father had taught her. She feels stable. A little nose heavy, but stable. Perfect. Now let's get the landing gear down. The gear lever should be a big handle with a wheel symbol on it. Maya found the gear lever and moved it to the down position. The plane shuddered slightly as the heavy landing gear extended, and she heard the reassuring thunk of the gear locking into place. 3 green lights, she announced, seeing the gear position indicators. Landing gear is down and locked. The approach into Seattle-Tacoma International Airport was the longest 10 minutes of Maya's life. Captain Stevens talked her through each step of the process, from intercepting the instrument landing system to managing airspeed and descent rate. Maya's small hands could barely reach some of the controls, and she had to stand up in the seat to see over the instrument panel clearly. Maya, you're lined up perfectly with runway 16L, Linda Carson announced. You're doing an incredible job. But Maya was struggling with the final approach. The aircraft felt different at landing configuration, heavier and more sluggish than the flight simulators she was used to. The runway was coming up fast, and she was terrified of making a mistake in these crucial final moments. Captain Stevens, I don't think I can do this, she said, her voice breaking. The plane feels too big and everything is happening so fast. Maya, look at me, listen to me carefully, Captain Stevens said, his voice calm but urgent. You have flown this approach perfectly. You are lined up with the runway. All you have to do now is what your father taught you. When I tell you, you're going to disconnect the autopilot and gently pull back on the yoke to flare for landing. Trust your training. Maya's hands were shaking as she gripped the controls. The runway was rushing toward them now, growing larger in the windscreen. Autopilot disconnect, she said, pushing the red button on the yoke. Suddenly, she was hand-flying a 737. Now Maya, gently pull back, Captain Stevens coached. Just like your dad taught you. Ease the nose up and let her settle onto the runway. Maya pulled back on the yoke, feeling the massive aircraft respond to her input. For a moment that seemed to last forever, they floated just above the runway. Then, with a firm thud that shook the entire plane, they touched down. Reverse thrust. Captain Stevens shouted. Pull the reverse thrust levers up. Maya found the reverse thrust levers and pulled them into position. The engines roared as they helped slow the aircraft. She pressed gently on the brake pedals, just as her father had taught her, feeling the plane decelerate. We're down. We're down. Maya shouted, tears streaming down her face. We made it. The cabin erupted in cheers from the conscious passengers. Emergency vehicles were already racing alongside the aircraft as Maya steered it off the runway and onto a taxiway, following instructions from ground control. As the plane came to a stop, Maya slumped back in the observer's seat, exhausted and emotionally drained. She had just accomplished something that professional pilots trained years to do, and she had done it under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Maya, Captain Stevens' voice came through the headset one final time, what you just did was extraordinary. You saved every life on that airplane. Your father would be incredibly proud of you. Emergency medical teams boarded the aircraft immediately, treating the unconscious crew and passengers. The food poisoning, as Maya had correctly diagnosed, was caused by contaminated chicken that had been improperly handled by the catering company. Everyone would recover, but it would take several hours for the crew to regain consciousness. Maya was finally able to call her father from the airport. When she told him what had happened, there was a long silence on the phone. Maya, her father finally said, his voice thick with emotion. You remember what I always told you about knowledge and preparation? Yes, Dad, that they could save lives someday. Well, sweetheart, today you proved that absolutely right. You didn't just save lives, you saved every person on that airplane. I am so proud of you I can barely speak. Later that evening, as Maya sat in the airport waiting for her father to fly in from Anchorage, she reflected on the day's events. She had started the morning as just another unaccompanied minor, dismissed by adults who saw only her age and size. But when crisis struck, her knowledge, preparation, and courage had made the difference between life and death for 127 people. The businessman from seat 12E approached her as she waited. His expensive suit was wrinkled, and he looked somewhat embarrassed. Maya, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. In my life. I'm sorry I didn't listen to you earlier. I learned something important today about not judging people by their age. Maya looked up at him and smiled. It's okay. Most adults think kids don't know anything important. But my dad always said that knowledge doesn't care how old you are. As she waited for her father, Maya opened her notebook and began writing about the day's flight. She had new procedures to document, new lessons learned, and most importantly, she had proven to herself that children could indeed possess unexpected knowledge and courage when faced with impossible situations. The media would later call her the miracle girl and the youngest pilot in history. But Maya knew the truth, she wasn't a miracle. She was simply a child who had been taught well, who had prepared thoroughly, and who had found the courage to act when lives depended on it. Her father had always told her that being a pilot wasn't about being the strongest or the biggest. It was about having the knowledge, the judgment, and the courage to make the right decisions under pressure. At 11 years old, flying at 36,000 feet with unconscious adults all around her, Maya had proven that courage and knowledge have no minimum age requirement. The flight would change aviation training forever, leading to new protocols for food safety and emergency procedures. But for Maya, it simply reinforced what her father had taught her from the beginning, that learning and preparation could indeed save lives, and that sometimes the most unexpected heroes are the ones who need them most.